G'day everyone, welcome back to the shed. We're continuing with part 2 of our door repair series, and if you haven't seen part 1, please look at it because it does go into a lot of what we're continuing on with here. I have deliberately made a repair patch for this corner of the door which is not accurate, and it's to simulate if you've made something and you're not that experienced with metal shaping and it's less than perfect, or you've bought something that manufacturing tolerances are less than perfect and you've got it on your door and you've got some alignment issues. This episode we're going to be looking at how we can correct all that. So I've got a deliberate mismatch on the bottom here and I've got it deliberately wide on this corner down here. And I'm thinking we're probably going to look at 3 ways to repair this side, and this bottom side we'll just put some weld on there and grind it to the right shape. So that's pretty easy. In our last episode, we put a big gap up this edge here and then welded it up badly and let the panel warp all over the place, and we've brought most of it back. Where it is at the moment, we can actually fill across that. That's an acceptable fill repair. So if you've got something at this stage, there's no problem with actually putting a bit of filler in there and making it back to being a good panel. But once we've got this edge crimped around here on our repair patch, we can make this a lot better. We can get it back very close to the original. There's a couple of spots, like just in here, where the panel wasn't quite lined up when it was welded. There's always going to be a little bit of a shadow in there and a low spot, no matter how good you get it. But we can get a lot of this ripple out of it. We can get this line lifted up so it's straight across rather than having this little bit of a hollow in here. And we can do all that even after it was badly welded. So settle in and we'll get into it. First job we're going to do is just crimp these edges over. So that's pretty easy. But I'll flip the door over and we'll grab a hammer and dolly and get into it. Now we're on the business side. We deliberately made sure the prominent line in the outside of the skin lined up. So we weren't really worried about the bottom alignment because that's quite easy to build that up with some weld once we've got it folded over. But what we need to look at now is the lap. Now, because we're restoring the car, we want the door to look good on the inside as well as the outside. So we want this lap to actually line up when we put the door back together. Now, this one being short and the same amount of material poking up, the wise thing is to trim it back a little bit. But what I'll do is I'll do part of it trimmed back and then we'll leave the rest of it long, and then we can look at ways that we can tidy that up after we've got it on the car. So, this little corner in here's got a factory spot weld just in from the end and a little bit of the original lap there. So we'll trim that right back and then we'll just use that piece of factory lap in this little tiny piece on the end. So that comes back to... Now normally you would get rid of that piece of material, but once again we're looking at ways that if you find yourself in this situation, this is how you get yourself out of trouble. So that's trimmed down quite tight, and I can get a little bit more off that yet. So once I work this with the dolly and the hammer, I can get that to sort of tuck in there next to that original piece, and that'll work. And I know that we are out by nearly 1/8 of an inch there, so 2-3 millimetres. I can trim the same amount off the top of the lap here and it should fold over. So we'll do a little bit of that. This is roughly the difference between what we've got on the factory door and where this edge is going to be. So when it folds over and we add some material to the bottom, it should come back to looking factory. And then the last little piece we'll leave oversized and we'll trim that on the door. Now, folding over skins, I just like to do them with the hammer and dolly. Dolly flat underneath the panel and then approach it on a bit of an angle with the hammer. Once we've got it folded over well past 45, we can then just come in and hammer it straight down and crimp it in place. Okay, we'll just come in with a quick close-up and we'll get this little area in here. Now we've got the first piece I've trimmed to tuck in next to the original crimp. We can get a weld just along there. We've got the next section which is pretty much in line with where the original crimp went to, and we've got this piece that we've left deliberately long that we'll come back later on and just prune off once we've got the door all welded together. Now you can take a little bit of time and get this crimp down nice and tight and get a nice straight firm edge along the bottom here, because this is actually what's holding the skin in place. It will have a few spots of weld around it to lock it so that the door can't twist within the skin, and we'll talk about that later as well. But we just want this nice and firm and a solid crimp on there. Now, I think what I'll do now is just throw this edge over here, even though it's well out of alignment, but we could look at cutting it so that we can do one piece separately. Now this bottom is so far out that it's just so obvious. So if you're in the situation of putting a patch on like this and you can see it's this far out, the smartest thing to do is to open that crimp out and then refold it. So we'll do this bottom piece just like that right now. That's been done on the fly, so I've got a little bit of dents and things like that on there, but I'm not that worried about it because we're only doing a demonstration here. But what I'll do now is just trim this into the corner there, and we can prune a little bit of excess material out the way and we'll refold it. Now, in most cases, your frame is accurate to the door. Like there's just a tiny little bit of mismatch there, but it's never going to be that far out that it's going to be an issue. So if we folded just outside the frame line, we're going to come back to being close to where the original should be. So we'll use the door as a reference and then we'll crimp the skin over. Now if you have repaired the frame and it's all your own material in there, quite possibly that will be out of alignment. So in that case, make a little cardboard template or a little steel template of the opening on the car. Pick up a part of the door that's original, pick up another piece of the car that's original here, and then before you start playing with this, mark the outside of the skin and you know where the fold is. From that point, you can measure from the edge to your mark, measure from that edge to the inside, and know that you're actually going to be clear of your frame. If your frame needs to be trimmed off a little bit, do it at this point. Otherwise, we're going to be fighting the whole thing and having the whole panel too big. But it's not the end of the world. We can repair that as well. So I'm just going to run a rough trim line up here because we know that this overlaps roughly 3/8 of an inch or around about 10 millimeters. And we'll leave that much material there, and then I'm just going to fold it with a pair of vice grips. The little tricky thing is this corner in here. It'll need a cutting wheel to just trim that back a little bit to get our lap right on the little 45 in the corner. So we'll get him trimmed up and then we'll fold him over, and then that'll be that first part of the repair out of our way. So I've just cut through the top layer most of the way there, so I'll just get the excess piece out, a little chisel, get rid of that bit, and that's just going to fall off so that we're lucky. Now if you're not quite there and there's still a bit of material sitting in there, a pair of side cutters will get that out quite easily. And I've got the angle a little bit wrong. I'm not going to worry about it for what we're doing today. I like to fully weld these corners. Most cars weren't welded in the corner originally. If you go back further in history, early 60s into the 50s, they would always bronze the corner, so there'd always be a little bronze weld just in there, and that's not bad practice. But I tend to just run a little bit of MIG across there, grind it all smooth, and then I put a little tiny bead of sealant around the inside. Even though these cars never had a sealant on them, it does help with the longevity of them. You can wipe the vast majority of the sealant off and you'll only have the tiniest little bead just in the seam, and it's very hard to see once the car's put together. So for now, I'll just let this overlap in the corner. I'm not that worried. So we'll grab a pair of vice grips, throw that up there, crimp it over as normal, and then that's our first example of how to get yourself out of trouble with a badly fitting repair patch. I don't need to use a little depth gauge piece of metal to bend it because I'm going to use the edge of the frame as my reference in this case. So we're going to come in and we'll be just outside the line of the frame by, at the very most, 1 millimetre, probably half a mil, so talking less than a 32nd of an inch. So just bring him up, move the vice grips along, and we're not trying to throw all the metal up in one go. We'll do several passes, and that way we'll get a nice even bend on it all the way along. So now we've got this to, I'd say, 70 degrees, something like that. It's nearly there, so hammer and dolly and we'll get the rest of it to come over easily. Now I did cut myself a little bit short on there, but I'm not worried because, like I say, we're only doing an example here, and the lap in the corner I thought would overlap is actually cleared, and that's come back to quite a reasonable factory looking join in there. So what I'll do now, just crimp over this last little piece where it sits, and we'll have that well out of alignment, and then we can look at some ways of repairing that as well. Where that little reverse curve is in the outside of the skin, I'm just using the curved side of the dolly in there, and then back to the flat for the flatter part of the skin. Now we've got our patch on the door, but it's not fitting very well at all, and we've actually got the crimp is sitting outside the frame from about here all the way down. So this is extreme. Like, I'd be very surprised if any of you can find a repair panel that's fitting that badly off the shelf anywhere, but it proves a point that we can actually have something that is less than perfect, it's not accurate to the factory dimensions, and we can make it fit on the door. So what I'm going to do, because I want this inside lip to actually look factory, I'm going to split this down the front edge. If your repair is not out by much, we can just simply grind from this point here into here and cut through the two layers, and we'll do that first, and then what I'll do is probably from about this point down, I'll get the cutting wheel and just cut this piece through on the edge. And then what I'm going to do is just move that little folded piece inside so it lines up to where it should be. I can tack it at both ends with the welder so it's going to stay there, and then we can look at grinding the skin to suit it and then welding this edge back up. Now this is cheating, guys, but you are allowed to cheat. We all get into trouble. We've all got to have ways to get around it. And the only reason I know how to do this is I have been in these situations before, and I have made pieces that haven't worked out that well. I've bought pieces that haven't worked out that well. And these are methods that I've come up with over the years to actually get a good result from a poor panel. So this lip is now free all the way through, and we're just going to bend it carefully without cutting ourselves on the grind mark on the corner, and we can get that into where the factory had it. So from that point, we've got the rough shape of the door. Now, it's advisable, most cars come with a door on each side. If you are in this situation, I always recommend doing one side at a time and then using the other side as a reference panel. So if we have got this door with a problem, we've cut the original piece away, we've got no record of how it was, we can make a cardboard template of this corner from the other side door. And even if it's rusty, but still original, we've got the outside dimensions still there in most cases. So that's not quite where I want it just yet, but it's very close. A few little taps, and we've got him back in where he should be. Just put a little spot of weld on that, that'll hold it in place, and then we can shape the outside skin to the right shape, and then we can weld that seam up. Now, given this one's so far out, it's quite easy to just run the tin snips down that line and remove this outside edge that's waste material. We can just grind it away as well. If it's not that bad, just get your disc grinder, a few little passes along there, even a cutting disc on an angle grinder, and you can just follow that inside edge and get the waste out the way. So we don't need this material, we just want it gone. I've got a bit there I've got to grind because it's too close and the snips are just starting to roll it, so we'll grind that piece away. But what I'm going to do first is just tidy it up a little bit with the hammer and dolly to get the two panels sitting together nicer than what they are. Now, when you're welding corners and edges, run with a little bit more current and wire speed than what you would normally do if you were just welding a flat panel. So what I've gone on this welder is I've gone up to my 1.2mm thick setting, so that would be your 18 gauge material, and that will work perfectly for welding this edge down there. But it will always be just a little bit more grunt than what you would normally have if you're trying to weld across a panel. So what I'm going to do is we need a sequence of tacks across here, but because this is a crimp, we need it to pull together really well when we do it. So just going to put my vice grips on there and just pinch that corner together, and we want it fairly firm. So work your way along it and just pinch it together. I'm at the point where they'll almost lock on, but letting them flick back, and that's squashing it down. And we're getting a nice tight little crimp there. So what I'll do now is I'll get a tack just in here. So that's going to be 25mm, roughly an inch from where it's welded before. And we'll work our way along like that, and then we can start welding it as if we were just welding across a normal panel. Now we want to get a nice deep burn here, because this is going to become the edge of the door. So if you weld it and you actually burn into the metal and it's starting to create a scallop, that's a perfect setting for your welder, because we want to leave a weld in there without a heap of material sitting outside the door. If you're welding along and it's too cold, the weld's just going to sit on the outside of the skin, and then when we grind it all up and make it pretty, it's going to want to split along that edge because you haven't got the heat to actually burn right into the piece of material. So there's the edge of my weld. It's burnt in roughly 2 millimeters. So that's a good burn into there. We know that's attached properly, and in this case we've probably even joined it onto the frame, which is not a problem when we're doing this sort of work. So, and as you can see, there's a little bit of build there on the outside edge, but very little to grind away. So if we can get the whole weld looking like that, it's a job well done. Now if you move your vice grips and you've crimped it along there and you get a little bit of a bulge in the middle, you can come along with your hammer and dolly, hammer it down. If it wants to spring up and down, don't panic about it too much. The more weld you get on there, the more stable it will be, and then you can come back and hammer and dolly it together and get a nice tight crimp. Now, I've deliberately got a lot of angle on my welder, because the electrical arc is going to drop off the bottom of this wire and eat a bit of a hole behind where it's going to start depositing the wire into that cavity. It's digging that trench. It's actually making the spot for the weld to fit in there. If we angled the welder like this, we would get a lot less penetration. The weld would actually sit on the outside edge instead of burning in. So put your tack in there like that and just pull it back towards yourself a little bit, and you'll get it to burn in and build a nice puddle of weld in there that'll join all our panels together. There's a little bit of paint contamination in there that just made it spit a little bit. It's just as I was finishing my weld puddle, all I did was broke the arc, just waited momentarily, hit it again, and filled in that little cavity that was created by those little explosions of paint material burning within our crimp. Okay, you can see where we're going with this. We don't have huge lumps of weld, we've burnt it all into the panel. It's going to make a nice edge for the door. And if you find that the edge of your door is a little bit high because of what we've added on here, but well within the thickness of that weld, we can get this on the car, we can get the panels lined up, and we can just put our grinding disc in there on its edge, and we can just trim the edge of the door, and we're in no danger of actually cutting through that weld as we're shaping the door to fit, in this case, the fender that sits beside it. And that way we can actually gap our door and get a perfect fit everywhere. We'll just weld this together and then we can get into grinding it up and making it look like a door. So what I'm going to do is weld back to my tacks. So we've got the end here where I've actually joined the crimp onto the door skin. We'll weld onto that one, and then because of what we're doing, there's very little danger of actually distorting the edge of the door. I can just do each one in turn as I work my way along, and then once it's cool enough I can come back in and fill the gaps in. A little bit of rust where we've gone onto the original door skin, but when we do our proper repair that'll all be gone anyway, so we don't need to worry about that. Now we've got a sequence of nice welds along there, and there's no huge build-up on there. So this is the area that we can actually work when we want to do our fine tuning and getting to fit the door to fit the car perfectly. Just going to allow it a little bit of cooling time. We don't want to overheat the panel. There is things that we can have trouble with by doing this, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but because I'll talk about it now while it's cooling down. We can put too much heat in here, and we'll have problems with the door skin because of it. Now, every weld is going to shrink. It is molten metal. You heat metal up, it gets bigger. You cool it down, it gets smaller. That is just a physical fact. We can't change that. So if we're putting molten metal onto a panel, it's as big as it's going to get. Now, it will shrink in every direction. So if we do a weld along a panel, it's going to get shorter, but it's also going to pull in on itself. So if you can imagine the weld ball, the bead of weld on top of a panel underneath it, and it's sort of roughly this shape, it's going to shrink in on itself all the way around, and usually what will happen is it will create a bulge in the panel just in from the edge of the weld. And you can sit there and you can hammer that bulge, you can heat shrink it and stuff around with it, and it will take forever to get it reasonable. Now, in the past, I have put strips on the back edges of fenders, wound up with this problem where I've had to gap them and get them right, and I've had a bulge in there, and I've wound up cutting that piece away. But came to me one day out of the blue, there is a very easy solution. What has happened is this weld has shrunk. It is actually pulling that panel up like that and creating that bulge. All we have to do to fix that is stretch this weld. So if you find yourself in a situation and you've got a bulge in your panel just in from where you've welded some on the edge of the door skin, all you have to do is hammer and dolly and work your weld. And you can go hard on it because this is a good solid hard lump of metal and it will take a bit of beating. But once you start squashing that down there, the bulge that's back in that skin will disappear. Trust me, I'm a professional. And as easily as that, we've got it welded. So that was pretty much 2 passes on top of the tacks, and we've got that edge sorted. A simple grind now will get that door back to being the factory shape, and we've got a really nice repair on it. So we can look at our mismatch over here, and you've guessed it, all we have to do is add some weld onto it. Same deal as here, treat it like a weld across a normal panel, series of tacks. Don't be really worried if your normal pass of weld is not going to make it up there. You can do more than 1 pass. If you have a problem with it bulging the panel, work your weld, squash it back down, and you'll bring it back to where it should be easily. So we might hop in, just get this piece here welded, and then we will start working along this edge. But what I'm going to do is go back to my normal setting on my welder that I will do for doing a panel repair. That is not quite as violent, a little less current there, and we can actually slow our weld pass down because we've got this crimp on the edge here and build some material up. Also, we're not going to weld at such a steep angle. We'll lift the torch up and we'll go slower and we'll build some weld with that. Okay, couple of things here, guys. I didn't grind any of the paint off, that's why it was spitting and farting. I did a no-no because I'm not really worried about the quality of this repair. I pushed it along and the arc was actually burning the paint off before the metal was actually dropping in there, and we've got quite a lump of weld there that you would have to grind away. But like I say, for what we're doing, it's completely irrelevant. We'll start with our build-up weld now, and we'll come in and we'll start at this end, work our way to the end, and we'll just put a few pieces in there to actually get it to build out. Now this time round, we're getting a bulger weld on our piece of metal. We're not actually getting it to burn in like we had over here, because we've changed the angle, we've changed the current and voltage, the wire speed, and we've changed the speed. We're travelling a lot slower now because we actually want it to build up. Important thing here, because we're putting a lot of material on here, let it cool. This is where you're going to run into trouble, is if you start trying to short circuit, get in a hurry and get it done. Just be patient with this one, right? Let it cool right down. So we'll let that happen, and then we'll come back to it and start building it up from there. We can see our mismatch here. We know the bottom of the door through here is accurate, so that's all good, and we're going to need at least another pass of weld on top of what we've already done. So we'll start by working off these welds, getting a bit in there, but if they wind up being a bit higher, we know we've got no problem there. So we'll get some more passes done, and then we'll call this one done. I'm going to hit it a bit quick. I'll let it cool down for that first pass, but it really is a bit hot. But in the essence of getting this done and moving along with it, and it might actually give us a nice bulge on the back that we can work with later. So I'll just get into it and we'll get a bit more done and get him built up. Normally I would leave this cool down a lot more.
How long?
More. You really want to be able to hold your hand on it comfortably. Okay, we're heading for enough material in the end there. The straight edge is just touching it, just in there. And we've got gaps in the middle, but we'll work our way along it, we'll get it done. And we need to get a little bit of material in here just so we can create a nice radius on the edge of the door. Very rarely you will find a door with a sharp corner in it. Normally they've just got a tiny little radius on there. So we want enough material in there. And we've got a little bit of a mismatch on our skin lap here. That's something that can happen at home too. And from that point of view, we want to get a little bit of guts into the metal on the edge there. So by putting some weld around that corner, we're actually building a little bit of thickness there, a little bit of durability. And in this situation, if you found yourself with a problem like this, there's no problem with just actually running your weld through and filling this little gap in here and welding it to the frame. And it's going to make the door super strong and durable. There's no chance of rust bleeding out of it in the future. But before you do that, fit the door to the car and make sure there's not a twist in the door, because as soon as you start welding skins down to frames, you're going to lock the door in the shape. And if it's got a twist in it, you're going to be fighting it a lot to actually get it to bend enough to get it to close properly in the future. So don't weld the corners before it's been on the car. Now I've got this little situation in here where I trimmed a bit much off this, and like I said before, I wasn't really worried about it, but what I'm going to do is just run a little bit of weld along there to fill in this point through to probably here, and then we can grind that to actually simulate a straight line through here, and that'll make it look more like a natural lap. Now, jumped onto that way too soon with that second pass, but like I say, we're just trying to get it done, and I'm not really worried if we get a bulge, because then we can actually repair that as well. So straight edge on here, looking down, that's pretty close. I've got a couple of little spots in the middle. Just in there, that cavity's a little bit low, and that one there probably is as well. So we'll fill in a bit in there, bit in there, and a bit in there, and I'd say we've got enough material that we can grind it out and get a good looking repair from that. Now we've got a good builder weld in there, and there's no real pinholes or cavities in there that are going to cause us any problems. And even if we actually grind this surface back flat, and we've got a few little depressions where the weld isn't quite filled back into this level in here, it's not going to matter. Paint will fill that, and it's not like there's a pinhole through inside that's going to bleed a bit of rust out. So what I'm going to do is I'll get this little bit of weld just in up here now, and it wouldn't matter if that weld actually stuck to the frame, but normally you'd have a bit of weld through primer on that piece, and if you're careful you can actually just get your weld to sit in and stick to this surface and not that surface, just to create a little bit of a dummy line down here. You would have seen that spitting and farting as I was carrying along down there, and that's because I've actually got a rusty door frame with paint still on it. So that is actually the reaction from that. But in saying that, we've actually got a quality weld. That's actually got no contamination and no pinholes and things that are going to be a problem. And we've created this edge that runs down here, and naturally, I haven't worried about this. You'd actually just bring it out there if you're going to go the whole way and get it looking nice all the way along. But we've got pretty close to a straight line. So from here, we can grind that smooth, and then we'll get a cutting disc and just run down this back edge and create a dummy lip down here, which will look like a factory door. I've got that ground up. There's always going to be a few little spots where you're going to want another little bit of weld in, and we've got one just in here on the bottom edge, and we've got a couple of spots along here that are a little bit low. But it's important to sort of get it to this stage and then just come back and nitpick your area a little bit, and you will chase them through to perfection. So for what we want to do today, that's about as good as we're going to do it, and we'll just move on to something else. But what I will do is I'll just grab the cutting disc on the angle grinder, and I'll just tidy up this line through here where I put the bead of weld on it, and where we left this overlap a little bit large deliberately, we'll just trim that off as well. So we'll grab a couple of little close-ups, and then we'll just tidy them up, and then we'll say that's that part of the repair done for this side of the door. Earlier on I had my hand out while I was grinding, catching the sparks, and that was for no reason other than to stop the sparks hitting the camera lens. So don't do that, guys. It wasn't hurting, they're not hot or anything like that, but it's not a practice you should be doing, so just point that out. So we'll grab a couple little close-ups on this, and we'll say that that's this side of the door, good enough for the demonstration that we're doing. From here, the more nitpicking you do, if you fill these with a bit of weld, grind them over, it's really quite simple. And just tidy up that little low spot in there, a few little spots along here. Now we've got a bit of grinding to do on this side, and we've actually created a little bit of bulge just from the edge, and it's actually caused this to drop a little bit further over here where we had that low spot from before, and same thing, we've got a little bit of a bulge in here. So I'll grind this up and then we'll work this weld with the hammer and dolly just to spread that out a little bit, and then we'll come back to this. But if you have got a repair at home to this level, that's a fillable repair. That's probably 3mm of filler. It's not a problem. You could just fill an area in here, around across this area here where it starts to drop from here. But I'll show you an easy way to bring that up as well. So we'll get on with it. I'm going to work this weld all the way around it because we do have a little bit of an evidence of a bulge in here and a little bit up here, and like I say, that's causing a problem further down here. But we'll just work it from one end to the other and backwards and forwards a couple of times. And this is one of those times where you can actually hit it fairly hard because the weld shrinks in on itself. It shrinks in on itself from around the corner and pulling this edge up. So we want to actually get that very corner piece stretched out. So it's a little bit of work. Using fairly sharp and heavy blows this time. Now this is the area I folded. I didn't need to go that hard on there, but once again I'd forgotten about it because we'd done different types of repairs here, but that's got that little crimp nice and firm in there as well. So. Now that's taken out this little bit of a lump we had here and the bit of a lump we had here. We've still got this low spot over here. So now we'll look at filling that up and bringing that up to get it in line with the door as it flows through here. Now these are just some simple sheet metal tags that I've made and welded onto bolts. And I'll weld these onto panels where I've got problems like this and I want to work it from one side, and I'll attach my slide hammer onto it, and you can give it a nice sharp bump and it'll lift that area up there quite easily. So we'll do that, and then I'll give you another option. What I've done here is put this on with 4 nice decent tacks, and I've actually hit it pretty hard. So I've welded that in there with a pretty solid thing, but I've done it from one side only because we do want to get this off the panel again. So when it's time to remove it, it's only a matter of just running the cutting wheel into those tacks, giving this a little fold, and it'll pop off, and then we can grind any metal away that might be on top of there. So we'll just grab the slide hammer, give that bit of a tap away with that, and that will get most of this out. Now this was a slide hammer I made out of scraps 30 years ago, and it's fairly heavy, but it does work very well. Now that's lifting that, and we've pretty much got this side of it here to pull through in a straight line. This side here's come up, but what we'll do, we'll keep the weight on it and then just work the panel around it. Now that's lifting this area. Now here's the other option. If you don't have a slide hammer, a tag with a bolt or a piece of threaded rod welded onto it, and then any piece of metal with a hole in it as a bit of a weight. So what we're going to do, just hold the panel up with this lump in here, and when I'm working it with the hammer, I'm working against this mass in here, the weight in here. Because my hammer blows are lighter than what this is, it's not going to yank this down. So you're going to get that reaction where we're holding the panel up, working around the low spot, and we're lifting the low spot from the middle, and we're using this little bit of inert weight in here, just sitting here, just soaking up those blows and making the panel bend underneath it. So we are very close there. We're a bit low on that line there. I'm not going to push it any further for today. I've shown you enough of what we can do with that. And from here, it's only your own time. You could sit there and you could perfect this, and we really could get this a whole lot straighter than what it is, but it's really at the point of why bother now. So. Even from where it is now, if we got a dolly inside it and just worked this weld area around here, we would be bringing up the tiny little bits and pieces that are left in this now. But like I say, we've just done a demonstration. Where you guys want to take it from here, that's what you do in your own car panel. But from here, we'll just move on to doing something else. So I will point out, we did a butt weld on here. I'm going to do an overlap weld now, somewhere along here. Always work to what your skill level is. Not everyone can do a butt weld. It's easier to do a lap. So we'll talk about that a bit now. I'll cut a piece out of the door in here somewhere, and we'll just quickly put a patch over the top of that, and very quickly, very easily, and I'll just do a small one down the bottom here just to do a demonstration on that. Should be a lot of fun. What I've done here is I've just cut out my rusty patch so we can pretend that there's a rust hole in here and it doesn't spread any further along. And I have cut the basic piece out that's got the rust in it. And what I've done is cut a little bit more each side, because we'll lap our new panel in over the top and sit it on top of this piece. But because of this bottom rail, we don't want to be disguising a weld and a lapped piece of metal over this much car door and actually having a little ripple in the bottom. So I've ripped it out, and we'll do a little butt weld on the bottom here, which with that other piece inside it, that's very easy to do. So if your skill level is at lap welding, do it like this, recess it into the bottom of the door, and we'll get it out. So I'll knock the pieces out, and then we'll just quickly make a patch, grind the door up there and sit it on, and we can talk about how we go about welding it. Very quickly, very easy, just folded a lap on the bottom of a piece of metal and it fits in the hole. And I might just trim a little bit off the top of it, reduce that lap. Now, if you are doing a lap joint, it will require to be filled. There is no way that you're going to weld this in there, grind it and make it flat. So, a couple of ways we can go about this. We can weld this on now, and the natural action of the weld will drop this area just a little bit, and we can fill across that. You can buy a nifty little punch. I don't own one, but the punch will run around. They're pneumatically operated. You could get a battery one these days, I don't know. But it will just put a little recess in this edge around here, and that will drop that in flush. You can get your beater weld around the edge of it, and then you can grind that off, and that'll come up pretty smooth. Or we can just get a pair of multi-grips or a pair of pliers or something and just bend that edge down a little bit. We can also get our hand inside the hole, hold the dolly up against the back of it, and then we can just drop this edge a little bit here just to allow the piece of sheet to sit in. So we might do a combination of those now, and we'll get it so it just sits below the surface or just down to the same surface as the door beside it before we start to weld it. There's a little curled edge on it from where I cut it. It's just bending down a bit there. So I'll tap that out first, and then we can have a play with this bit. So let's just straighten that curled edge out through there. That's all good to go. I'm sitting my panel in here now. I'm going to put a bit of a line around it so that we know the area that we're going to be working to get the door to drop in a little bit. And I think I like this here. What have we got? 4mm or so it's probably a little bit more than 3/16 of an inch. It's probably not quite a quarter. We've got about a quarter here, but we're heading bigger here, so I might just trim these a little bit, and we'll just go with a little lap rather than a big lap. Strangely enough, I'm out of my comfort zone here. I will butt weld all the time, but I thought I'd throw this one in here because many of you people out there will be looking at a butt weld and going, don't know if I can do that. So there are other alternatives. Now, years ago, I used this method myself for many years before I moved on to having the skills to be able to butt weld patches. Now, back in the day, these little tiny MIG welders were expensive and hard to get. 0.6 wire wasn't common because the industries in this region, particularly that used MIG welders, were all heavy industrial. So I welded with 0.8 wire in quite a large welder for a long time, and that one would not butt weld. There was no way I could make it butt weld. I don't think I could even do it successfully today. So when that was my basic machine that I owned, I lap welded everything, and all I would do was seal the back of it off with a good sealant when I'd finished to keep the moisture from getting in between the lap and the replacement piece of metal. There are cars out there that I did restoration work on 30 plus years ago, and they haven't rusted since, and it's just the nature of the beast. If this is your skill level, go with this system. Don't have a problem with it. Just going to work just outside my line a little bit, and I'm just going to put a little bit of a bend in it there. Now that's not bending it much. Really wants to go a bit more. I've got from here up, I can't get the end one because of the shape of it. And let's drop it a little bit. So that's got that corner just down a tiny little bit. We're only looking for 1mm, so it's not very big. So we'll get the dolly in there. It's a bit of an awkward shape to get into there. And what I'll do is just tidy this one up a little bit. So that's bent down these two sides, just enough for it to sit in there. And for the purpose of demonstration, I'm just going to leave this one alone. Because we've got this notched in at the bottom here, we can get the bottom edge down flush with the door itself, and we can actually hammer this down a little bit if it's a little bit proud. For comparison, you will need a little bit more grunt in your welder for doing a lap weld than what you do for a butt weld. So I've got this set at my 1.2mm thickness setting for my welder, and I haven't done any trial runs here. We'll just give it a go and see what it comes up with, but I think it'll be close to the money. So what I'm going to do is just spot these bottom corners, because that's the accurate piece. That's what we want to be in line, is the bottom of the door when we finished. So if we just put a bit of weld on there, and then we'll get the panel sitting in place and we'll start welding around it. So that's our bottom secured. That lines up all the way through there, and we've got this natural little bit of springiness in the panel. So all I'm going to do is hold it down in place, get a few spots around it, and then we're ready to weld it together. Our little panel is secure now. Now it's the same deal as before. We're going to let the heat go out and we're going to wait until it's comfortable to put our hand there. But there is no reason why I can't be fine tuning this. Next to these welds, I've got little gaps and high spots on my replacement patch. So I can be tapping them down and making sure that this patch is ready to weld. Now with a lap weld like this, instead of angling the wire directly into the join, run the weld parallel to it, just outside it, and let the weld bead grow to cover the edge of the piece of metal. And that way you're using the strength in the parent piece of metal behind it to absorb the heat, and this panel's now stabilised that we're putting into it, and we can just let the puddle flow out and pick up the weld. So I'll just run a quick pass like that, and we're going to go much the same as what we normally do when we're doing a butt weld. Same sort of process, it's just a matter of the angle of the torch, and we want a little bit of angle of approach just so we get the same thing where the weld will actually cut into the panel. But because we've got this little recess on the side here, it's not as critical. So if your angle of approach is like this, it's still going to work because we're relying on this puddle growing and flowing over and catching the edge of this piece of metal. Now I ran one downhill, and because of the visibility and the lighting I've got in here at the moment, I couldn't actually see the edge. So I've run on a little bit of an angle accidentally, but it's welded together, there's no problem there. Ran this one uphill, but I held a little bit of an angle of approach so that it would bite in. Just natural, comes to me like that. Force of habit. But it's the same sort of weld. I did it for visibility. I could see where I was going on the join that time. So we will wait for it to cool down a little bit. Same thing as before, stay in control. If you see that there starts to be a scallop happening somewhere, just let it cool down a bit, tap your pieces of metal back so they're in a straight line again, and then a bit more weld. Another thing I'll point out, with welding a patch into any panel below a style line where you've got these little reverse curves coming up to them, quite often the shrinkage on the weld will pull this line out a little bit, and you'll find that when you finish, this might not be quite as deep and pronounced as what it was before. Generally it's not by much. Generally skim a filler on there, you've repaired it anyway. So it's just something to be aware of. I always prefer to shift my repair patches up above any lines and work into a bigger area of panel, and it seems to have less effect on these lines. But anywhere where I've put a piece in, particularly long pieces along the bottom of a door along here, usually you'll lose some of the definition on this here just because it drags the metal down and it straightens this out a little bit. A little bit of spatter out of the shield just stuck on it there. What's happened here is the heat of these welds has actually curled this down in here by itself. So this is the edge that we left flat, and that's going to grind off reasonably well with this method of welding. But you can see it starts to bend down from about here and curls under that piece, and the sides that we bent deliberately have got the same thing on there. So that's what we did. This is what the panel's doing by itself. A lot of people will send me this question: why don't you cool your weld as you're doing it? Well, quite simply, if you want to shrink a piece of metal, heat it up red hot and rapidly cool it. So what I might do now is just do a couple of passes of weld, and we'll do exactly that, and we will just see what happens to the panel when we run a bit of weld and cool it immediately. So I'll grab a bit of damp rag and we'll just dab that on as we do a bit of weld. Right, we can see in detail it's got a pulled section in here. There's a spot in there where there's a ripple, there's a spot in there where there's a ripple, and we've dropped it right over here as well. And if we look at this curl up in here and look at this curl here, we have reduced this curl here by probably half of the depth on this piece here because we've been cooling our weld and shrinking it down. And we've got a ripple pulling out here now that we didn't have in the panel before. So I'm going to say that that's conclusive. Don't quench your welds, guys. Just let them cool down. Take your time and do it. A lap weld will work beautifully. We have done the sides and things before we started quenching it. We're getting the tops in there nice. It is an easier way to weld car panels. The only drawback is you do wind up with that little lip on the back of your panel, which if you get moisture in there, it will start to rust. Another disadvantage of doing this, a bit of moisture creeps in there before you've even finished the job, and you've already got the potential that rust is going to start. The moisture could be sitting in there when you seal the back of it, and it's trapped there until you have a rust problem. But like I say, at one point in my life, this was how I did all my repairs, and those cars are surviving beautifully because the backs of the panels were sealed up watertight before the cars were sent back out into service. Work to your skill level. This will work. This will work. If you get a bad repair patch, you can correct it before you put it on your car, or you can correct it after you've put it on your car like we've done here today. And at the end of the day, with a little bit of work, you can get your average panels looking pretty good. When we come back, we will be taking the bottom piece of this door skin off, and we will be getting into some good solid frame repairs, and we'll build this up as if it was a normal repair in a normal shop, just getting ready for the skin. And once we've got the frame in tip-top shape, we'll get our replacement skin on and get a full weld all the way through. We'll burn it on with a MIG. The MIG is easy, the MIG is fast, and we'll get a very good repair on it. Thanks guys, we'll catch you next time. Trust me, I'm a professional.